This is a Pulp Archive recording. All public Pulp Archive recordings are licensed under Creative Commons. For more information or to support us, please visit patreon.com/pulparchive. This episode was prepared by Soul and narrated by Goodman, the digital narrator. The Devil Takes a Hand by Ward Sterling. The Black Mask, November 1920. This episode contains period-typical depictions of crime, violence, and mild profanity. Listener discretion is advised. Tennant stopped outside the door of his wife's room and went over the details of his plan for the last time. The thing was so absurdly simple that he wondered why he had not thought of it months before. There was not the least chance of a failure. He had only to plant the idea in her diseased brain, and she, with the cunning that all maniacs possess, would do the rest. Everyone knew her suicidal mania. It had been brought out at the time of the hearing. No blame could possibly be attached to him for her death. Had not the nurse frustrated her in half a dozen different attempts? Damn that fool nurse anyway. She had too exalted an idea of the importance of her position. But after all, it was possibly a good thing that she had been so vigilant. People couldn't say that it was carelessness then. He smiled to himself as he recalled the kind things their friends had said when he refused to send his wife to an asylum after the court had pronounced her insane. They imagined that it was his great love that made him keep her with him. It was laughable. How easily people could be fooled. How were they to know that he had made a careful investigation and found that too close a watch was kept on the inmates of such institutions? There was a better chance of her making a successful attempt right here at home. Accidents are always liable to happen in private houses. In public institutions, people are paid to guard against such things. Curse the fool law that prohibited a man getting a divorce from an insane wife. Such laws made a criminal of a person. Otherwise, he could have married Helen a year ago. He must guard against his love for her being found out. It might cause someone to cast suspicion his way. Of course, they would never be able to confirm their conjectures. But his position in the community was too high to have even the finger of scorn pointed in his direction. It would never do for a deacon in the church and a prominent professional man to let people know that he was guilty of evil, even in thought. No, he must keep away from Helen until he had shown the proper amount of respect for his deceased wife, for he had begun to think of her as already dead. After a period of hypocritical mourning, they could be quietly married, and he would still retain the love and respect of his fellow townsmen. Of course, it meant several months waiting. It would be hard, but they would have the rest of their lives together, and both of them were young. And there was the matter of Grace's inheritance to be considered too. Good thing they had never had a child. It would be all his now. That is, after the proper formalities had been gone through. Naturally, he would erect an expensive headstone to her memory and give her an elaborate funeral. Some people measured a man's love for his wife by the amount of money he spent on her funeral. Yes, the scheme was simply Machiavellian in its magnitude, and with the requisite amount of attention paid to the details, there was not the least bit of danger. He turned the knob and entered the room with a tender kiss for the woman with lusterless eyes, who sat mumbling to herself in the low wicker chair, nervously picking at the folds of her dress. He turned to the middle-aged woman in nurse's garb who sat in the window nearby. "Better take an hour's walk, Miss Gorman," he said kindly. "You look fagged out. I'll look after Mrs. Tennant until you return." The nurse arose wearily. "It's awfully kind of you, Mr. Tennant. I am tired. She's been bad again today," she ended significantly. Tennant's face took on a worried look. "She'll probably settle down again in an hour or so," he responded. "I've a little work to do. I can do it just as well in the other room and still keep an eye on my poor little girl. There is nothing around that she can get hold of, is there?" He settled himself in a chair beside his wife and patted her white hand affectionately. With a tear in her kindly Irish eyes for the little unostentatious display of love, Miss Gorman left the room, and a minute later Tennant, from his place in the window, saw her swinging down the street. The time was at hand. Chapter 2. Pressing his wife's hand tightly between his own, Tennant addressed her in the tone one uses in talking to a little child. "I've often wondered," he said quietly, "why you didn't commit suicide, Grace. Of course, I know that you've tried it, but your methods have been all wrong. Do you understand what I'm getting at? I want to help you." He looked at the woman keenly. He imagined that her dull eyes took on an added brightness, that she was not plucking at the hem of her dress so nervously. He hurried on. "Now I am going to show you how to do it, sweetheart. Then, when the nurse is out of the room someday for a few minutes, you can put one over on her. It'll be a good joke on her, won't it? Come on, and I'll show you how to do it." Apathetically, she arose and followed him across the floor to where the big, old-fashioned bed stood in the distant corner. "Now, watch me, dearie, and see how I do it," he continued. "The nurse thinks that she's got you cheated by removing everything that you might use, but we'll show her, won't we?" He removed the light counterpane from the bed and twisted it into a rope. "See, girlie, how it's done. Just the right size to hang oneself with, isn't it? Now then, we carry this chair across the room and put it under this chandelier. Get the idea?" The demented woman made no answer. But Tennant knew that her suicidal mind was attracted by the scheme, that the seed planted in her brain was already sprouting. She followed close behind him, her dull, impassive eyes watching his every move. He stepped upon the chair and attached the improvised rope to the chandelier. "See how easy it is, dear," he went on. "Now next we make a noose in the rope. Like this, see? It's just as easy as rolling off a log. Then we put the noose over our head and pull it up tightly about our neck. Understand now, all that's left is to kick the chair out from underneath, and the devil and all couldn't keep a person from choking to death." "Could her?" From his height atop the chair, he looked down upon the woman. She was gazing up at him, fascinated, her eyes burning brighter now. "The idea pleases you, doesn't it, sweetheart?" He smiled. She nodded understandingly. Then suddenly she made a leap for the chair and tore it from beneath his feet. With a frightened yell, the man dropped to the end of the rope, his toes almost, but not quite touching the floor. The maniac stepped back with a shrill little cry of delight, and watched him gyrate and whirl as the improvised rope twisted and untwisted itself. His mouth was open, his eyes bulged from their sockets. His tongue stuck out oddly, his breath came gurglingly, sobbingly, gaspingly. His face grew black and mottled, his legs and arms danced about curiously, twitchingly. His peculiar antics filled her with delight. She forgot her depression in her newfound happiness. He was teaching her some new game. She clapped her hands together and shouted for more. And when he hung quiet, she seized him by the legs and swung him to and fro, yelling joyously. And thus the nurse found them, the living and the dead. An hour later, when she returned from her walk. At the beginning end of The Devil Takes a Hand by Ward Sterling. The Finishing Touch by Charles S. Wolfe. The Black Mask. November 1920. This episode contains period-typical depictions of crime, violence, and mild profanity. Listener discretion is advised. A hasty survey assured Ridgely that he was alone on the starlit country road. With a sigh of satisfaction, he plunged swiftly into the brush which skirted the roadside. There he paused, alert, until his straining ears convinced him that his movements had been unobserved. Then he made himself comfortable for his brief vigil, crouching there. He reviewed minutely his actions so far and his plans for what was to come. There was yet time, if he had erred, if there was a flaw, to withdraw quietly. It was merely a matter of waiting for another night. To be confronted with the damage wrought by an overlooked trifle when it was too late would be agonizing. And his very confidence disquieted him, made him feel that there was something amiss, yet he could find no weak link in his carefully forged chain. His left hand, dropping into his coat pocket, found the bottle of cyanide of potassium solution securely corked and ready to assume its role. His automatic weighed heavily in the other pocket, well oiled and loaded. The light mask which now covered the upper half of his face was really of no importance, just an extra precaution which discounted the possible, but highly improbable intrusion of some pedestrian. The cyanide he felt sure no one would be able to trace. Several weeks before he had stolen a couple of small lumps, quite enough for his purpose, from the private laboratory of a friend who rode the hobby of chemistry. Few people knew of the existence of the little attic laboratory. Fewer still were aware of his acquaintance with its owner, and the man himself was ignorant of the fact that his supply had been levied on. Since the deadly stuff had been dissolved and bottled and the bottle scrupulously cleaned, he had taken pains to avoid touching it bare-handed. Right now his left hand was gloved with rubber. There would be no fingerprints to damn him. Footprints need give him no concern. The roadway was dry and reasonably hard. The discoverers of the corpse would quickly obliterate any slight clues of a definite nature that he might thus leave. The keenest of sleuths could examine the scene of his crime. To their heart's content, they would learn nothing. He had made no attempt to establish an alibi, and in this he was satisfied he had acted wisely. The business of trying to demonstrate that you were where you were not is usually a dangerous undertaking. It involves either the employment of confederates or the use of complicated subterfuges, which must either function with precision or turn into veritable boomerangs. The collapsing alibi is too often the royal road to the electric chair. Ridgely knew that there was just one person who could be relied on to be forever silent on this night's work: himself. Better to take the chance of the authorities being unable to prove that he was on the spot at the time than to assume the burden of proving that he was not. And anyway, most of the precautions he had taken were no doubt unnecessary. They represented merely his forethought in forestalling unlooked-for disaster before it occurred. The chances were that the case would be looked on as just what it seemed on the surface: suicide. There would probably be little more than a perfunctory inquiry, an inquest at which every fact produced would seem to demonstrate conclusively that the man took his own life. Ridgely prided himself that the idea of killing a man by forcing him to kill himself was a master stroke. A man found dead on the road, dead from the effects of poison, and with the bottle containing that poison clutched tightly in his stiffened hand, is obviously a suicide. There is no reason to suspect foul play unless someone is known to have a strong motive for putting the unfortunate one out of the way. And, to the best of Ridgely's knowledge and belief, Maury hadn't an enemy in the world save himself. And thanks to his consistent and flawless dissimulation, his secret was his own. Outwardly, he had been quite friendly with Maury. Not too friendly, just enough so to be counted. Really indifferent. In the rare event of murder being suspected and a murderer sought for, there would be no reason for alarm. One other only might possibly connect him with the night's events. Maury's wife. Jean Maury and Ridgely shared a rather guilty secret. She could assign to him a motive, but here again he was confident that perfect technique had practically nullified the danger of aroused suspicion. By guarding every word, by well-planned and controlled actions, he had assured her belief that he, like herself, was a harmless flirt. Not once had she been permitted to glimpse the terrible passion that was his. Never had she been allowed to plumb the depths of his crafty and daring nature. He was safe on that score. Under the pretense of carefully guarding her reputation, he had concealed their affair from outsiders, and to her herself he had made the matter seem trivial. There was one circumstance, however, that might cause comment, and as he thought of it, Ridgely grinned. While it was true that no one apparently had a motive for slaying Maury, it was equally true that the man had no apparent motive for killing himself. Happy, carefree, comfortably wealthy, and well satisfied with life, people might wonder that he should court death. Ridgely grinned. For it was to this, to his mind, the weakest point of his whole coup, that he had devoted the most thought, expended the greatest effort. He had supplied the motive. Here was the artistic triumph of the whole thing. Here was the finishing touch. For the suspicions of the authorities would be allayed before they were aroused. During the 3 months that he had known the Moreys, Ridgely had quietly and unobtrusively collected specimens of John Morey's handwriting. Through diligent practice, he had perfected the art of imitating the man's scrawl so convincingly that he had no fear of the fraud being detected. Not only had he studied the writing itself minutely, but also the style and tricks of speech. Beyond doubt, the missive he had crafted with such care would pass as the dead man's own work. He drew forth an envelope, and by the light of his electric torch, scrutinized with pride and satisfaction the letter he had written. The envelope was addressed to Mrs. John Morey. My dear Jean, I am sorry, terribly sorry, for the notoriety this thing will cause. I realize that you will be shocked. I am asking your forgiveness. For 4 years I have suffered in silence. Our marriage was a bitter mistake. I did not love you. I realized it when it was too late. I've done my best to conceal the fact from you, but I know I could not go on living a lie much longer. I am taking the easiest way out. It is only just that I should suffer for my own sin. John, as he replaced the letter in its envelope, Ridgely chuckled. He would place this missive in the man's pocket after he had fallen, and there would be the motive all ready to satisfy the most critical. Scandal-loving eyes, scanning Morey's past for sensational disclosures of his implied double life, would not dwell too closely on the method of his demise. He stiffened. The soft thud of moving feet on the hard road reached his ears, growing steadily louder. He knew it was Morey. The moment had come. Ridgely's hand closed resolutely over his automatic. Morey, he knew, was unarmed. He slipped soundlessly to the very edge of the copse and waited until the approaching form was only a few feet from his ambush. Then he sprang out, weapon leveled, barring the way. There was a startled oath as Morey caught sight of the ominous figure before him. Ridgely's gruff command to throw up his hands was instantly obeyed. The surprise was complete. "Don't speak," Ridgely said, hoping his disguised voice would completely mask his identity. But it didn't matter, really. "Do as you are told. You are going to sleep for an hour or so while I clean you and make my getaway." "Really?" Morey was regaining his nerve. "I haven't enough about me to make it worth your while." "Shut up." Ridgely's command was curt as he advanced toward his victim, the deadly bottle in his gloved left hand. He extended it toward Morey. "Drink it," he growled determinedly. Morey lowered one arm and took the bottle hesitatingly. "What is it?" he asked, falteringly. "Chloral hydrate, if you must know," responded Ridgely in tones of well-feigned sulkiness. "Enough to put you out for a couple of hours. Knockout drops. Take your choice, drink it, and go out for a couple of hours. Or," he waved the automatic suggestively, "go out for keeps." "Look here," began Morey. "I'll promise. Drink it." Ridgely snapped savagely. Without further parley, Morey raised the bottle to his lips. It was only an instant, really, but to Ridgely, waiting anxiously, it seemed hours before the body crumpled to the roadway. Then swiftly he went to his victim, pocketing his automatic. His gloved hand inserted the letter into Morey's pocket. He noted that the bottle was tightly gripped in the dead man's hand, and noiselessly he stole away from the place. A shortcut through a little woodland brought him out onto a main road without haste. He wended his way toward the summer hotel. He was jubilant. Morey was out of his way. He had only to wait for the proper moment to increase the ardor of his courting. He felt that the widow would lend an attentive ear. He passed no one on the road. Everything was coming his way. As he gained his room unobserved, he was whistling softly. Not a pang of remorse came to sear his conscience. Ridgely wasn't that kind. He turned in and slept like a top. He was awakened by a sharp knocking on the room door. Bright sunlight was streaming through the thinly curtained windows. A hasty glance at the clock told him that it was after 10. The knocking continued insistently. He sprang out of bed and reached for his bathrobe. "Just a minute," he called, as he hurriedly pulled a comb through his tousled hair. An instant later, fairly presentable, he was gazing inquiringly at the tall young man who had pushed in through the partly open door. Even before the other had introduced himself, Ridgely knew that his caller was a detective. Something must have gone wrong, he thought, and his mind raced swiftly over the details of the evening before, seeking to find and forestall the consequences of a slip. He was not panicky. His visitor was speaking. "John Morey was found dead on the road late last night, Mr. Ridgely." Ridgely carefully sidestepped a possible trap. "An accident?" he asked, in perfectly feigned surprise and concern. "No," replied the other. "He was murdered." Ridgely concealed his dismay. How had they reached that conclusion so soon, in the face of his carefully prepared evidence to the contrary? "Murdered?" he echoed blankly. "How? By whom?" The tall young man sat down, watching Ridgely narrowly. His right hand had dropped carelessly into his pocket. He leaned forward slightly and spoke swiftly. "By you, Mr. Ridgely," he replied evenly. "No. Don't interrupt. You set a very pretty stage, my friend. And you have been careful to a fault. It was your little finishing touch that betrayed you. That and a woman's vanity. Mrs. Morey is a very beautiful woman with a very plain name. It has been her little failing to hide that fact. Her name is not Jean Ridgely. It's Jane, and Morey never called her anything else in private. When she saw that letter you so cleverly left, she knew Morey had never written it. Despite the excellent forgery, for he hated the name Jean as much as she disliked Jane. She is a big enough woman to admit her own shortcomings, and— Shall I read the warrant? Thank you so much for hanging out today. My name is Saul, and this is the Pulp Archive. Now, if you had fun, I'd appreciate it if you could like, subscribe, comment, and share. That stuff really helps. And like most stories we cover here, today's was recommended by you. So, if there's a story you'd like to see, send us an email at pulparchivelibrary@gmail.com. We'd love to cover it. If you'd like to support the podcast and keep us going, consider subscribing to our Apple channel or becoming a member on Patreon. Just visit patreon.com/pulparchive. For as little as $5 a month, you'll get access to all our podcasts and private explicit episodes that wouldn't be allowed publicly. We feature almost every genre of pulp fiction: horror, detective, western, and even sports. Special thanks to our patrons who make the podcast possible and make every episode of the Pulp Archive happen. Every episode is dedicated to our Patreon members. I truly could not do this without you.